welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing a review of William Gibson's novel Neuromancer, the first entry in his Sprawl trilogy. I specify this because I wasn't originally aware Neuromancer was part of a trilogy, and I'm not sure it's common knowledge for people who aren't specifically cyberpunk aficionados, which I don't consider myself to be as such. I've enjoyed what I've tasted of it, but it's definitely not my favorite subgenre in science fiction by any means. Still, given Neuromancer is considered a more recent classic of science fiction, it was published in 1984, just like The Handmaid's Tale actually, given it is more crucially considered a not genre-creating but genre-defining piece of fiction, and given I have now watched and played, or rather played by proxy, I guess, a fair bit of cyberpunk fiction, in no small part due to the fact a dear friend of mine is a big fan of the subgenre, I figured I really should give this one a try. Neuromancer's story opens in the crime-ridden underworld and jurisdictional no-man's land of Night City in Japan, or what used to be the country of Japan at any rate, and yes, I am 1000% convinced Cyberpunk 2077's Night City is named after Neuromancers. If someone wants to confirm that for me, I'd appreciate it. Where we are immediately introduced to its main character, Case, a street hustler and former computer hacker, here called a console cowboy, reaching the end of his luck. He is a rather gloomy and self-destructive character whose only wish is to be able to access the high of cyberspace again someday. Indeed, this ability was taken from him at the height of his career by a mycotoxin, and he now compensates for his, I'm assuming, feelings of emptiness with pharmaceutical highs and the high-risk thrills of living on the edge, basically. Then, just when he thinks he's hit the very final end of his road, he encounters a razor-bladed street samurai named Molly Millions, who introduces him to a shadowy figure named Armitage, and an opportunity to permanently regain his access to cyberspace, involving a high-stakes heist and an AI entity or entities who may ultimately be the ones pulling the strings for their own mysterious reasons. ... Neuromancer centers on one main character, Case, but uses a hybrid of third-person limited and third-person omniscient narration to progress its story. This means you see the story through Case's eyes to a certain extent, just like with Connie in Women on the Edge of Time, which I also read and reviewed last month, but there is also a greater remove between the reader and the main character here. And this allows for the insertion of more detached descriptive passages, which then serve to develop the world-building, or its aesthetic vibes at any rate. Speaking of descriptions, I feel a little split when it comes to Neuromancer's prose. Now, this was a debut novel, and I've heard and read Mr. Gibson's writing improves significantly in books 2 and 3 of the Sprawl trilogy and other works he's created since then, but still, I can only judge what I read in Neuromancer, and I found its prose both very effective and fairly clumsy at times. Most of it comes alive and feels, yeah, inspired when painting the portrait of the book's cyberpunk underworld and the alternate dimension of cyberspace, the Matrix itself, but it, flatlines somewhat when it comes to having the characters be, well, characters in their own right and having them interact with one another. Even the inspired quality of the cyberpunk aesthetic gets a bit overwrought or just plain clunky in places. The novel's opening sentence, for instance, left a really weird sensation in my mind. So it's as follows: the sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. I think, the metaphor Mr. Gibson was going for with this sentence, but at the same time I feel it just doesn't really work. Its texture, for lack of a better word, feels wrong. And there are a few moments like that spread throughout the book. There's also obviously a lot of technobabble here, right? Pharmaceutical names as well, actually, which must have been rough going back in 1984, but I didn't find it too difficult to pass given I am an SFF reader from the 21st century and given I have watched a fair bit of Cyberpunk 2077 on stream. quite frankly, and you know, I've seen the Matrix trilogy and so on and so forth. I already had a few visual and conceptual reference on hand, basically, which made the reading experience smoother than it otherwise probably would have been. Structurally, Neuromancer follows a straightforward narrative progression. The story is divided into several different parts. Chapters are short to average lengthwise, and that was all fine. The way the story transitions from one setting to another, however, yeah, that was rough at times. I agree with a lot of other reviewers there, and the pacing was just very uneven overall. The plot takes a bit of a while to get going, but once it does, it's just, we're doing this to prepare for the heist, okay, done, moving on. We're doing that to prepare for the heist, okay, done, moving on. Then we're with space Rastafarians, yes. Then we're on a luxury orbital vacation spot. Then we're doing the heist, etc. Then bam, the end, more or less. I mean, that ending specifically felt very rushed, especially considering it just kind of skipped over what could have been the main fodder of its theming. Neuromancer definitely felt like all the science fiction when it came to character work, because there isn't much of it to speak of at all. None of the main characters had any real depth. One of them barely counts as a person, human personality-wise, so I'll allow it there, I guess. But I certainly didn't care about any of them beyond the fact, you know, I rarely relate to characters in fiction to begin with. Case is the main character of Neuromancer, like I already said. The sole, slightly removed narrative point of view, and what can I say about him? He's an underdog, an emotionally dysfunctional, even stunted when sober, outsider, desperate to experience the highs of cyberspace again, and presumably fill his inner void. You do learn he loved a woman once, kind of, and this love interest has a minor role to play in the story, but that's about it. Then there's Molly Millions, the archetypal, maybe, cyberpunk street samurai. She's a badass, alright. Has razor blades embedded in her fingertips, as you do. And cybernetic eyes, and her calling in life is to be a badass for hire, basically. You learn she once had a love interest as well, a street hustler named Johnny, though not Johnny Silverhand, like in CD Projekt Red's RPG, who didn't seem that different from Case to me based on the sketch you get of him. And then you learn that she also worked as a prostitute, whose conscious awareness was switched off on the job to cater to particularly vile and degrading snuff movie tier fetishes in order to pay for her fancy cybernetic razor blades. Since I have nothing to add about the character work itself, I'll now seize the opportunity to go into a mini-rant in 3, 2, 1. I am just fucking done with the cavalier and gratuitous usage of sexual objectification and, more crucially, sexual violence to illustrate how edgily horrific an invented world is to progress a story's plot, or, most of all, to add edgily tragic flavor to your, yes, specifically female character work. I don't fucking care if it's used to flesh out a character's background, to develop a character's arc, or, God forbid, to give a male protagonist the opportunity to redeem themselves. Yes, looking right at you, The Magician's Trilogy, I won't say more than that. I am just so fucking done with this shit. If you cannot or will not take the time to understand and explore what this stuff does to an individual human being in the short and long term, and potentially in relation to a wider societal context of, you know, structural inequality and oppression, just fuck right off. I very nearly DNF'd Neuromancer because of this casual reference to Molly having been exploited in snuff porn and prostitution to finance her fancy claws. Yes, she tells Kate she eventually hunted down a bunch of peeps connected to the joint she worked for, but that's it. She's just, you know, the female badass, so this shit is no real big, right? All that raping and abuse is good for edgy, tragic female character clout. Am I right, ladies? Fuck off. And yes, I know some female authors do it. I know it's sometimes done with male characters as well, but we all fucking know there is a sex bias pattern with this shit. Don't fucking at me. Anne McCaffrey getting raped kinky in some of her pan novels doesn't change the fact it's mostly male authors doing this shit with mostly female characters, period. End of story. It's less of a problem today, granted, but I still read all the works of SFF and in other genres, so going forward, if I learn through my own research or a friend of mine that a book I'm considering for my TBR that aren't already on said TBR as of right now because reasons, display this kind of gratuitous and cavalierly handled content, I will not read it. This shit is triggering to me, for one thing, and just goddamn offensive, honestly. And lazy. Can we all agree about this? It's fucking lazy to boot. And no, it doesn't mean I think any work that features this type of content is worthless in terms of broader literary, storytelling, thematic, what have you merit, but life is finite, time is limited, and there is a metric fuck ton of books out there. I'd ideally like to read things I will enjoy. So this is as good a filter as any to narrow the candidates down from now on. I can accept being triggered by sexually violent content if it's handled well and for good reason, notably, wouldn't you know, in feminist fiction, but that's it. Tied into this, there is also an entirely gratuitous sex scene in Neuromancer that, whilst not offensive, felt entirely nonsensical from a character and more broadly human emotional understanding point of view. Sex in humans involves emotions. Lust is an emotion, for instance. We're not robots, right? And just like with everything else, there's a right way to go about plonking casual sex in a story, and oh, so many wrong ways. There is, for instance, a casualer sex scene in Woman on the Edge of Time that felt entirely organic from both a character psychology and character dynamics point of view. It's not the kind of sex I would personally have or enjoy, to each their own, but it made sense within the plot given the characters it involved. The sex scene in Neuromancer, and in other such works of literature, just feels dissonant and there, sorry not sorry, to appeal to lit bros in need of random spice. Sue me. So that's a fail. Writing and character work-wise in my book. The best thing about Neuromancer is definitely its world-building, but it's a kind of world-building that felt almost exclusively channeled into, yes, I am using this concept again, aesthetic vibes rather than thematic exploration, which I needed a lot more of. That being said, it was groundbreaking, yes, I'm not going to dispute that at all, and it certainly had flavor, texture, three-dimensionality to a commendable extent. Megacorporations barely distinguishable from crime syndicates replacing traditional nation-states, people upgrading their bodies with cybernetic implants and blasting their minds with a plethora of fancy synthetic pharmaceuticals, the juxtaposition of an uber-rich technocratic elite vacationing on orbital stations and whatnot, and a dirty, polluted underworld riddled with petty crime and people vying for scraps of power and privilege despite it all. Cyberspace, yes, the Matrix and menacing AIs blowing Turing tests out of the water and potentially saying fuck you to the humans who created them. Hell, even the Far Eastern, Japanese specifically aesthetics, all of these elements started here with Neuromancer. Or rather, were here in Neuromancer, woven together into the aesthetically rich tapestry we now call the cyberpunk subgenre for the first time, as far as I'm aware. There wouldn't be a Cyberpunk 2077 without Neuromancer, kind of. And honestly, aside from any other piece of cyberpunk fiction, thank the gods I watched a good chunk of that game, because it really helped me to visualize everything in Mr. Gibson's novel. And okay, honestly, I don't actually like making without this one singular work, we wouldn't have X type statements. I don't freaking know that, and no one else does. We can only look back upon the history that has already happened the way it happened, but nonetheless, as it stands, the genre-defining epithet is one Neuromancer undeniably deserves. But once again, the quintessential cyberpunkishness of Neuromancer is more of an aesthetic vibe to me than anything else. A decently layered and multifaceted aesthetic vibe, mind you, but one that nonetheless felt underutilized in terms of deeper theming. There is a lot you can do thematically through the world-building lens of cyberpunk. You can explore the excesses of capitalism and generally related consequences of ecological and societal collapse through the very juxtaposition of a poor, exploited underworld on the one hand and a class of decadent corporate technocrats on the other. The whole high-tech versus low-life motif, that is the simplest way to describe what cyberpunk is all about as a storytelling aesthetic or subgenre. You can explore the nature and limits to our understanding of consciousness, the self, through AI and personality constructs, what it means to be an organic human animal, and just, yeah, life, death, and transhumanism, basically, through cybernetic enhancements, cyborgs, uploaded consciousnesses, and the consequences of all those things, or states of being, on the body-mind. And that's a lot already, right? And don't get me wrong, it's not like there's absolutely nothing in Neuromancer regarding those ideas or concepts. But there is shockingly little, given this is freaking Neuromancer. I've had more to think about in relation to the above themes through a specifically cyberpunk lens in other works of fiction. The Hyperion Cantos actually is the first work of literature that springs to mind, and it's not even a work of cyberpunk literature as a whole. But it does feature a cyberpunky storyline, AIs looking for God, and cybrids, which are kind of like the inverse of cyborgs, now I think about it. Instead of having a human consciousness in a robot body, you get an AI consciousness in an organically grown one. The character work was, also infinitely better, as an FYI. I felt more emotionally and intellectually engaged watching Blade Runner 2049 than I did reading Neuromancer, and this is the kicker for me, ditto watching the freaking Cyberpunk 2077 game. What's worse, Neuromancer has, like I said, a badly paced ending that made its story feel absolutely pointless to me. And whilst a genuinely bad ending to a good story will always be worse in my book, an ending that makes me go, so the point here was? No? Nothing? Well, then whatever, I guess. Still feels particularly bad. And maybe you can read this specific feeling of pointlessness as a theme in itself, but the whole sex and drugs and, well, okay, maybe not rock and roll, though kind of in Cyberpunk 2077, actually, but edgy nihilism thing is just not my cup of tea. I'm too old or simply, too philosophically unaligned with that stuff to enjoy it. Especially in a cyberpunk or more broadly science fiction / dystopian setting. If you sprinkle some of that in grimdark or Soulsbornian fantasy, I guess that's fine, but even then, nah, it's just not my thing overall. Despite the fact I read it over way too long of a period of time, I don't regret reading Neuromancer by any means. And also, despite, the triggering unpleasantness of Molly's character background. And I mean, I seldom regret taking the time to read classics of SFF literature, more generally. It's one of my primary things for a reason, after all. But I sort classics, both in SFF and other genres, to be clear, into two broad categories. Historical documents that help us understand the evolution of literature and, attendant culture, and works of storytelling art that continue to engage the reader on an emotional and intellectual level throughout time. And William Gibson's subgenre definer falls into the former category, in my subjective opinion, of course, as always. It was thus only a middling 5.5 out of 10 read for me that I can't really recommend as anything other than a historical document type classic. So do read it if you're interested in SFF literature as a broader topic, yes, or if you're just that crazy about cyberpunk as a subgenre, sure. Again, I'm not. I like it well enough Though, if pressed on the matter, I'd say I prefer biopunk, which I kind of subsume under weird fiction. I don't know if that's strictly accurate, you tell me. Or even steampunk, because I tend to like the way it blends, or can blend in, Victorian and or Gothic aesthetics. And it will come as no surprise that, no, I'm not interested in reading the rest of the Sprawl trilogy. However, I have recently purchased Cyberpunk 2077, let's go! So I can play it for myself and hopefully, presumably, enjoy its characters, story, and theming more than I did Neuromancers. And that concludes my review of William Gibson's genre-defining historical classic, Neuromancer. I hope you found this review interesting, engaging, all the good things. If you want to share thoughts, feelings, what have you, you are more than welcome to do so in the comments down below, as always. But on that very final note, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all reasonably soon in the next video. But until then, bye-bye.